Hello everyone. Before we get started with today's story, I would just like to point out that this is part 2 of a 2-part series. If you have yet to watch part 1, please click the link on the screen now. That having been said, let's get into it. Oh, and don't forget, keep the lights on, folks. After my grandfather took his last breath, I covered him up with a white sheet and left the room to call the hospice nurse. Part of me felt relief that his suffering and pain was over, though I also felt a great deal of sadness. I was always close to my grandfather.
Hello?
The nurse said, answering the phone immediately. "It's happened," I said. "Samuel has passed away." She sighed.
I'll be right over.
She said, hanging up immediately. The news hadn't been unexpected. They had said he might survive a few more weeks, but that he might die at any moment. I was grateful that he didn't have to linger for any more days in that horrid state. Taking morphine every couple hours just to make the pain bearable. Drooling, trembling, his eyes looking like tiny pits of water at the bottom of a deep well. I had asked him if he wanted me to get him a higher dose of opiates, if he wanted to hasten the end. He had looked at me seriously. "We cannot commit suicide," he said. "What is a few more weeks of agony compared to the potential for the ruination of my soul? What if suicide condemns us to hell forever? Or even just for a while? You must be strong in life, son, and you must try to be strong in death. Try to find peace, even when everything hurts and your body is failing." I nodded. He was a religious man, and suicide was a taboo subject. But I had to ask. He was clearly suffering with every breath and every additional moment of consciousness. I wouldn't have let my pets suffer like that, so why let a human being? But he was from a different generation, and he took the teachings of the Bible seriously. As I waited for the nurse to arrive, sipping a cup of coffee in the kitchen, I heard something rustling from the living room, where my grandfather's corpse lay. "Hello?" I said. "Is someone there?" No one responded, but I heard a slow shuffling, like someone dragging their feet slowly across the wood floor. I got up to investigate. My grandfather stood in the threshold of the door, the white sheet strewn haphazardly on the floor behind him. His eyes had turned pure black. A stream of blood trickled down his face from the sides of his mouth, drops of it splashing onto the floor. Like a trail of breadcrumbs, the blood led from the current position of his catatonic body to the bed where he had died. "Holy shit!" I said, jumping up. "You're okay?" He stared at me blankly, and he started shivering violently, his teeth chattering as he stared straight through me. I approached him slowly, a sense of dread coming over me as I got within a few feet of him. I waved my hands in front of his black eyes, but he didn't move. "Grandpa?" In a blur, his hand shot out, grabbing me by the throat and lifting me off the floor. He had an iron grip, his strength far above and beyond what a frail, cancer-ridden body should have been able to muster. I tried to speak, but he was cutting off my air. "Stop!" I managed to squeak out through the suffocating grip he maintained on my throat. I felt in my pockets as my vision started to turn black, grasping for my keys. With the last of my ebbing strength, I shoved my house keys into his eye, twisting it. His grip immediately slackened and I fell hard on the floor, gasping and retching, my throat burning and spasming. I coughed, taking in sweet lungfuls of air. My vision started to come back to normal. I looked up, seeing my grandfather staring down at me with a look of hatred and fury that I had never seen on his face before. One eye dribbled vitreous fluids and gore from the socket down his cheek, mixing with the dark blood that now fell from his nose and mouth.
"Your payment is due,"
my grandfather said in a voice that was totally unlike his own. It had a gurgling quality. More blood frothed and dripped down his chin as he spoke.
"Do you think I am a fool who forgets so easily? Your family owes me a debt, and I will take my payment now."
He stepped forward, stomping on my left arm with a manic strength that far surpassed his weight. I heard my elbow crack, a burning agony shooting up through my body as I tried to crawl away. At that moment, I heard a knock at the door. The hospice nurse poked her head in, a look of concern and confusion crossing her face as she saw the scene in front of her. She threw the screen door open and ran in.
"Mr. Middleton!"
She cried at my grandfather.
"What is the meaning of this?"
He looked at her, his mouth open in a scream of fury as he ran at her, dripping a trail of blood behind him. I tried to crawl away towards the bathroom where I could lock myself in, but I looked back. The nurse had fumbled with her keychain, pulling out a canister of mace and spraying it in his face. Her lips pursed in a scolding expression that made her look much older than she actually was. I wanted to laugh at the look on her face, but the fiery pain roaring through my arm brought me back to the gravity of the situation.
"Stop this madness!"
The nurse cried at him, soaking his face until the canister started to sputter and run out. My grandfather started clawing at his eyes and face, shrieking and running in circles, totally blind now. The nurse ran over to me, putting her hand out to pull me up by my good arm. Every time my smashed arm bumped the ground or a chair or the side of a door, it sent a shock like electricity rushing through my body. I squinted my eyes, trying to keep tears of agony, loss, and horror from pouring forth. The being who had taken possession of my grandfather had stopped clawing at his face. Dark red gouges ran from his forehead down to his chin now. It was a horrible, gory sight. His eyes streamed water and blood as he tried to blink quickly, hurriedly speaking and chanting in some language I had never heard before. A dark cloud seemed to pass overhead. The quicker he spoke, the darker it got outside. By the time the nurse had dragged me out of the front door by my good hand, the sky was totally black. I glanced up and saw I was not in my front yard at all, and that what I was seeing wasn't the sky. We were in the middle of some kind of cave with torches lining the walls. It was as if the house had been loaded onto some massive tractor trailer and dropped off in a totally random place, in the middle of a massive passage with stalactites and stalagmites crowding the chamber. The cave split off in front of us. One trail appeared to go up, the next one went straight, and the third appeared to go deeper down into the cave. I had no time to try to listen for breezes or feel for fresh air coming out of any of the tunnels. I started running on the trail leading upwards, and the nurse was right behind me. Torches continued to illuminate the way, flickering and casting off eerie shadows in the cave. I heard the door to the house slam open behind us. It echoed off the walls of the cave like a gunshot, making me jump. My skin crawled as whatever had taken over my grandfather began to wail. A sound halfway between a screaming woman and the shrieking jets of an airplane taking off. It was inhuman and impossibly loud, and I knew it was angry. It was running after us, its naked feet slamming against the stone floors. I couldn't run that fast with my arm on fire from the horrific break it had suffered, and the nurse wasn't very athletic either. I could tell she probably hadn't had to run like this in years, maybe even decades. She was extremely red and out of breath, and I doubted I looked much better, trying not to swing or move my damaged arm at all, and likely white as a sheet from the pain and adrenaline. But I was slightly faster than her still. With horror, I heard the thing grab her by the shoulder, flipping her around. She had been in my peripheral vision, and now she was gone behind us. I ran as fast as I could, her terrible screams following me down the tunnel. I turned one last time before I was too far away, and what I saw will continue to haunt me in my worst nightmares. Whatever had taken over my grandfather was biting her all over, drinking her blood. Her throat was mostly bitten open, bright red arterial spurts of blood pouring down the front of her body. The creature, in its frenzy, had bitten her over and over again. On the throat, on the face, on the stomach, and now licked and sucked the blood from every wound, moaning and sighing in pleasure. Pieces of my grandfather's body had begun to fall off. While sprinting after us, the skin and flesh of his feet slamming against the stone had worn off some, and now the bloody footprints followed them from behind. But there was something underneath my grandfather's body, wearing it like a child might wear a Halloween costume. I could see it poking out. It was twisted and pale, looking like braided bones covered in a thin, pale layer of skin. It looked back up at me one last time, and I saw my grandfather's face had begun to disintegrate too. Underneath it, I saw the face of what might have been a mutated old man. His skin mottled in blue, his eyes pure black, his nose looking like a crooked hawk's beak. He smiled, showing off teeth that were far too long and sharp-looking for a man. Then he turned back to his meal and continued biting the screaming, dying woman and sucking her blood. More pieces of my grandfather fell off in the struggle. Soon, I knew there would be nothing left but the creature underneath. The ferryman. I put distance between us. The echoes of the ferryman and the nurse followed me too far, bouncing off the walls and almost seeming to amplify with distance rather than fade. The tunnels got very thin at some points, so that I had to turn my body to slip through, but eventually I heard the soft gurgling of a stream up ahead, and that brought me great relief. I ran out of the tunnel into a huge chamber. The river I had heard stood about 40 feet off, giving the chamber a pleasant misty smell, though it mixed with something foul and rotten in the air. Mummified animals and people were lined up on the ground to my right, and to my left, a pile of dead bodies lay, at least 5 feet high in its center. It was disgusting to look at. Blood and fluids dripping off the fingers and faces of the corpses, bloating skin ready to pop like an overstuffed balloon, milky eyes with squirming worms writhing inside. I heard the ferryman who had taken my grandfather's body. He wasn't far behind me now. I had no choice at this point. I could try to swim across the river, but my grandfather had told me there were horrible things under its surface, hands that would drag you underneath and never let you go. I could take his boat, which was lying on the soft dirt not 10 feet away, but it had a thick rope on it to pull it back, and so I ran towards the pile of dead bodies. I tried to move one aside, but rancid gases blew out of the corpse's mouth, sending droplets of clotted blood and its putrefying stench right into my face. I almost vomited right there, but the ferryman was walking through the door. I could hear his footsteps by this point. I lay down and draped the body over myself. I kept my eyes towards the middle path in the center of the chamber, watching the ferryman. He had ripped off the rest of my grandfather's flesh, though patches of blood and gore still clung to his skin here and there. He was naked, hunched over, grunting and breathing hard. Unhealthy blue and purple splotches arose all over his skin as he walked. He turned to the mummies and with a few words woke them up. There were all sorts of animals laying there, from dogs to coyotes to bears, skunks, possums, cats, and much else. There were also humans and half-human, half-animals who reminded me of ancient Egyptian gods or hieroglyphs. Some had human bodies with large hawk heads or alligator faces. With creaking bones, they all began to move together. They pushed themselves up in unison, the tight white wrappings bent with their joints. In the eyes of all of them, however, I saw nothing. There was no glimmer of intelligence or consciousness. It was as if they were puppets being held up by invisible strings.
Go find him,
the ferryman said in a slow, powerful tone. I could see him standing not far away, fully transformed into his normal body now.
In the name of Haran, find him.
There were 5 tunnels branching off of this main one. I had come out of the one on the far left. I had no idea where the other 4 led, though I saw that they all led downwards, and all seemed to have endless torches lighting their halls. The creatures split naturally into groups, as if they were just water going downhill. There was no discussion, no looking around, just some sort of undead hive mind that told them instinctually what to do. After a while, I heard the ferryman begin to wander away as well. Once I was sure I was alone, I started to move the dead bodies on top of and around me. I was gagging and retching, trying to be as quiet as possible, but the smell was so strong that I could quite literally taste it. The smell of rotting bodies is horrible, like a combination of putrefying roadkill with rotting fruit and feces mixed in. It was all over my clothes and skin now too, and some of the clotted blood from the bodies had smeared across my face. I wanted to get out of there. As fast as I could, I slinked over to the boat. It was heavily decorated with arcane symbols, and in the boat, I saw paddles and a long stick. With my good arm, I dragged the boat over to the shore and pushed it into the water, jumping in as it started floating. It was lighter than it looked, for which I was thankful. If it was much heavier, I would have needed both arms to move it, and that wasn't happening. Using the long stick, I pushed myself off the shallow part of the riverbank, then started paddling rapidly with one hand. The river was significantly bigger than it looked in the darkness. Once I was about 1/4 the way across, I began to flag, needing to rest my sore arm. My broken arm had swollen up significantly, but the pain had gone down. It was now more like a constant dull throbbing that seemed to move in time with my heartbeat. I just kept telling myself that it was almost over. I was almost done. And then I'd be at a hospital with opioids and real doctors and clean gauze. Instead of here, on this cursed river next to a pile of decomposing corpses. Sighing, I grabbed the paddle again and started forward. The light here was fairly dim, since the torches were all gathered on the stone walls of each shore. I couldn't see much more than silhouettes. If I waved my hand in front of my eyes, all that appeared was a dim shadow. In the same way, however, I could see something moving in the water. It was too dark to tell exactly what, but something was alive down there. Of that, I was sure. I kept paddling, pushing my body to its limits. I could see the farther shore now. The light from the torches shone more brightly as I approached, and I could see more silhouettes under the water. There were bodies down there. Some of them had bleached white skin and swollen waterlogged arms and hands that they constantly waved at the boat. Others had black shining skin with reptilian eyes and huge fishy mouths that opened and closed underwater, grinning wide the entire time. I stopped looking at the surface of the water, keeping my eyes fixed only on the approaching shore, the path to freedom. And then I heard a sound that chilled my blood and nearly caused me to drop the paddle. The shrieking of the ferryman who had returned to this chamber. Looking back, I saw him standing on the shore I had just left, surrounded by a semicircle of mummified corpses who protected him as if they were members of some Praetorian guard. They started pulling on the rope, pulling me back to certain death. I calculated my chances. I was about 10 feet from the further shore now. In reality, I had no choice. My only chance was ahead. I jumped into the water. At first, I went under and came up. Nothing grabbed me or impeded me in any way. I was glad, and I started swimming forward as fast as I could. And that was when I felt them. Cold, slimy hands began to run across my pants, grabbing at my shoes, going underneath my shirt. Soon they were touching my face and trying to pull me under. I felt them all around me, but I was so close. I looked ahead. I was only a few feet away. A surge of adrenaline filled my body. I let them pull me under slightly, then opened my eyes underwater. I saw 3 of them grabbing me, and I kicked them in their faces, one by one as hard as I could. I still had my left shoe on, and when it connected with a swollen purple nose on a waterlogged corpse, the corpse shrieked underwater in anger and pain, blowing bubbles from its rotting body as it did so. Before I knew it, I was free, gasping and sputtering on the farther shore. I rolled on my back, coughing out some water. The boat was still being dragged back by the rope, and I knew I didn't have unlimited time. After a few more seconds of rest, I got up unsteadily and began to run. I ran out of the cave and into the woods, and it was just like my grandfather said. Some of the trees on this cursed trail were marked with an eye surrounded by clawed hands. I made it back to town, the place where my grandfather had grown up. I was over 200 miles away from my house, the place where I had started this bizarre journey. I called a cousin who lived about an hour away from where I was, got fixed up at the hospital, and eventually went home later that same day. Agents in black suits showed up that week and took samples from the house after I told investigators from the state police some of what had happened. But those strange, unidentified agents never asked me any questions. Needless to say, we didn't end up burying my grandfather's remains, and that was all my fault. Now, whenever anyone in my family dies, I will be there, ready to put 2 pure silver coins over their eyes for passage to the other side. For I never want to see the ferryman again, even though I know one day I will. And hopefully, I will have silver coins for my passage across the river.